Welcome to my channel. I call it Astronomy Meets Christianity. That's because we're using astronomy to determine the dates of Christian events in the life of Christ. One thing that's completely unknown, nobody knows, is when the Roman Census was happened on Jesus Christ's birth, on the day of Jesus Christ's birth. Our best minds, our best historians are all confused. There are actually two censuses done by Quirinus. One is this census, and the other one is when Ethnarch Archelaus, the son of King Herod the Great, was banished, and the Romans took over. And they confused the two. We're talking here about the first census, which is when Jesus Christ was born. Luke tells us, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria." Now, this is a slight mistranslation or bad wording. This taxing was made when this taxing was the first one made by Cyrenius, the governor of Syria, would be a better translation. "And all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. Joseph also went out from Galilee, the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child." Now, there's several things here. If you want to vote here in the United States, you're registered in a particular precinct. And I have to go to a particular precinct to go vote. If I happen to be visiting my parents in Texas or something, and the time of the elections comes over, I had to drive all the way back to California to go vote because I'm registered in a particular precinct. This is the same situation here. Joseph and Mary were registered in Bethlehem. This also means that Virgin Mary was born in Bethlehem. She wasn't from Nazareth, she was from Bethlehem. And that also means that she was a Roman citizen. She had to be present or registered in a Roman census. Now we know that Jesus Christ was a Roman citizen because the Sanhedrin, or the Council of Elders of the Jews of Jerusalem, couldn't kill him. They couldn't execute him. Otherwise, they would just stone him just like they did to James the Less. But they couldn't do that. They had to ask permission, and finally they had to convince Pilatus, who was the prefect of Judea, the Roman prefect, to sentence him as a Roman with a Roman punishment. Since to obtain citizenship, both parents had to be citizens, that means that his father Joseph was also a Roman citizen. Now, I'll explain all of that in a different playlist when I talk about Jesus' family. But for now, the facts are that they were Roman citizens. The other thing that's important to see is that, let's see. Okay. So that's what Luke tells us. The problem is, many historians nowadays say, "Oh, Luke was wrong. He was obviously wrong because there is no proof there was a census on that year. He must have been confused with 6 AD when the Quirinus did his final census." So by questioning the historical veracity of Luke, they're questioning the whole gospel. That questions Jesus Christ himself. I mean, they say, Jesus Christ may not have been a person. Maybe it was a literary invention. That's ridiculous. So I'm here to demonstrate with certainty when the census has happened. Um, Now, for example, as we discussed in a prior episode, AMC 5, Censurinus was a Roman author, and he wrote a book called The Natal Day, or the Birthday book, for his patron, who was a consul of Rome at the time, on his birthday. I provided a link, you can download it, and in it, he tells us in no uncertain terms, he explicitly tells us that the lustrum, which is a period of time during which the census repeated itself, was a period of 4 years, and the lustrum was closed on the 5th year. And that's why people get confused. People think that the census, or the Roman census, or the lustrums, were at 5-year intervals. No, they were 4-year intervals. The lustrum was closed on the 5th year, which is the first year of the next lustrum. He's explicit about it. There's no guesswork involved. And people ought to read his book, especially our scholars, historians, and professors. So then we need to get more information on the lustrum and the census. There is a site called Perseo's Digital Library, which contains numerous documents. If you go over there, for example, it has tons of texts by Caesar, Catullus, Cicero, Virgil, Herodotus, Homer, Plato, many more, Livy, and in it you can make a search for lustrum. You'll search the entire database. And here you go. And you can click on each one of these. You can see that they're a darker color. That's because I clicked on them. I have clicked to every single one of them. But you don't have to. I picked the most important or relevant information. For example, here, why would Joseph take his very pregnant wife, who was about to give birth, on a 3-day trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem? That was extremely dangerous. The reason is that when the census was enacted, the person that enacted the census said you'll be in prison or killed if you try to evade the assessment. Now, I don't know what the penalties were a few hundred years later, but they took it very seriously. It's not like you could avoid it. So, the closing on the lustrum was done in a ceremony in which it was a triple sacrifice of swine, sheep, and ox. And this was called closing the lustrum. And when you close the lustrum, it's because the census had been completed. So now you have a tie-in between the closing of the lustrum, which is a religious ceremony. I think it was an expiation ceremony where you sacrifice the pig and the ox and the sheep, and then you ask for forgiveness for the sins for the entire Roman people or the entire Roman nation. So you had the census and you had the lustrum. There are some instances in which the census was canceled, but you still closed the lustrum in a ceremony. In some instances, you did the census, and like it happened with Emperor Augustus, and there was a problem where people didn't agree with it, and you had to delay the closing of the lustrum. You had to delay the ceremony till next year. So there were two separate things, but they were usually together. You had the census immediately, you had the lustrum. Again, here, for example, if I click on this, I'll show you. I give you the link all spelled out, so you can type it by looking. I'll try to put it in the description. But if you go here, you see Titius Livy in History of Rome, Book 1, for example, says, performed illustration by a sacrifice called Suovetaurilia. And that was called the closing of lustrum, because that was the conclusion of the census. The closing of the lustrum, the ceremony was usually done in the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, which was a big field. And back when Rome was very little, the entire army of Rome fit in the Campus Martius. I think later they just held the lustrum ceremony there. Now what's interesting is you have 4 years for the lustrum, the period of 4 years. When does the census start? We're told in here, there's another couple places, but it tells us that the census commenced the prior year, was completed, and lustrum was then closed. So you have the last year of the lustrum. That's when the census starts. And the census ends, and then you close the lustrum. And then you close the lustrum. So things happen between these 2 years. The census starts the year before the lustrum. Let's keep reviewing the documentation that we have. Here is a Claudius has he did a census, but he's too far gone, so we're not going to look at him. We want to concentrate on the period for the years of Augustus Caesar. Now, what's really interesting is Caesar was very ill on his last 2 years of his life. And as we shall see, he missed the lustrum ceremony. And then he did it next year with the assistance of his son, adopted son Tiberius, who became the emperor. And he's performing the ceremony. And then, as he was finishing the census, I mean, it's a great crowd, and in the Campus Martius, let's see if you can see it better, blah, 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 blah. And then about the same time, the first letter of his name in an inscription on one of his statues was struck by lightning, which was interpreted as a presage that he would only live 100 years longer. Because the letter C denoted a number, yeah. So, he's performing the ceremony, and somewhere lightning strikes a statute that says Caesar. His name was Augustus Caesar. So he strikes the statue and erases the C from Caesar. And the C corresponded to the Roman number for 100. And then what was left was Acer. And it turns out that the Etruscan language, Acer, meant God. So they took it to mean that in 100 days he would become a god, or 100 days he would die. But we know when he died. He died on August 19th. So if you back out 100 days, that would tell you when the lustrum ceremony was done. In fact, let's check on that. Okay, if we put up an Excel sheet, we can put the months of the year. This would be May, June, July, and August. Now, Augustus died in the 19th, So if we set that day as day 100, and we go back to figure out on which day was the lustrum ceremony held, we see that ought to have been around the 12th of May. Sorry, the 12th of May. And we can double check that. May. We can double check that by looking at the chronograph of 354. Let's see. Where is it? I really hate the new windows. There. Chronograph of 354. So we look at the month of May, mensis Meius, and we look at the 12th of May, we see that it was the festivity of the Martialisi. Now, Campus Martius was the field of Mars, and Martialisi starts with Martial something. So it's something related to Mars, a festivity related to Mars. And it was done in the Circus Maximus. So, a festivity related to Mars on the year 354 occurred on the same day that Augustus was celebrating the close of the lustrum. So we're pretty much assured that that is the correct date, May 12th, Martialisi. Now, to drive the point that people had to go to the towns that were registered, there was a quote here that says, "This year the lustrum was closed." He says, "This was owing to the fact, as the consul explained to the assembly, that all those who had to return to their own cities in compliance with the consul's edict were registered in their own places of residence, none of them in Rome." So there were less people in Rome than they thought, because they were all registered in cities outside of Rome, and they had to travel to those cities to be enrolled in the census. And that explains why Joseph and Mary had to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Now notice, what was the census for? He basically counted all the citizens that were all the Roman citizens. But not only that, he counted their wealth, he assessed their wealth. And based on their wealth, they taxed everybody. So if you were a powerful senator, rich senator, and you had become richer, you didn't want the census to be performed. You better say, "Oh, there's a problem, no census was done," because otherwise you have to pay higher taxes. If you're a senator and you had bad luck in your business dealings and you have fallen below the wealth threshold to be a senator, and did the census and says, "Hey, you no longer have 1 million certezas or whatever in wealth, so we're striking you off the roll of senators." It was amazing. To be a senator, all you had to do is be a Roman and demonstrate that you had so much money. If you had so much money, automatically you became a senator. If you had less money than that, then you got kicked out. So the senators that were doing badly also didn't want the census to be performed. And for that reason, as Emperor Augustus will tell us, for 42 years before he came over, no census was done. People rather not rock the boat. the Here he says, the censors have discharged their functions in perfect harmony in the best interest of the Commonwealth. All those whom they struck off the senatorial rolls. So here's proof that if you don't have enough money, after the census was performed, you were struck off the senatorial rolls. So, and in essence, what happened is during the last year of the census, they chose the Senate, they held the census, and they closed the rest. So, now we'll talk about the evidence of when the census was performed. The most famous one is the autobiography by Emperor Augustus called De Res Gestae. I'll show you in a second. He reinstated the census to be performed on a regular basis, but he himself personally only participated in 3 censuses, 3 lustrums. So he gives the impression that only 3 censuses were done. No, those are of all the censuses, those are the only 3 in which he was directly involved. So let's take a look at his autobiography next. Alright, well, if you make a search on the internet for res gestae, which means things done, you'll find, for example, Livius contains the text. If you go there, it's basically his autobiography in which he says all the things he did. It's really interesting, and especially talking in first, how do you call it, first voice. It's almost like you're listening to him. It's just incredible. And he wrote this like shortly before he died. After he did the census, on the lustrum, as we said, on May. He died in August, so he wrote this between May and August of the year 15 AD. Amazing. So, he's talking about lots of things, but we can concentrate on the lustrum. And he says 3 times I revised the roll of the Senate. So that means that on each lustrum, he revised the rolls, like I said. And then he says, in my 6th consulship with Marcus Agrippa as my colleague, I made a census of the people after an interval of 41 years. So reinstated the lustrum. So, in his 6th consulship with Marcus Agrippa. Now, I've gone ahead and copied over from the last episode the list of Roman consuls and how they've been matched to the correct dates by astronomical events. The date that shows up on the list is erroneous by 1 year. It's off by 1 year. So this is the correct date. That's the little thing. So now we need to go to the 6th consulship of Caesar Augustus. That's the 7th. This is the 6th with Marcus Agrippa. So here we have a closing of the census of the lustrum. Let's make it pretty color. So this happened on his 6th consulship. Then we can go to the next. A second time in the consulship of Gaius Censorinus and Gaius Asinius. Censorinus and Asinius. So we go for Gaius Censorinus and Asinius. So here we have closing a lustrum on the res gestae. And then finally, I performed a lustrum in the consulship of Sextus Pompeius and Sextus Apuleius. That's when he died. And this is the one that's a little off. And I'll explain why. So here's the first census that was held after 41 years. So this is when he restarted the censuses being done on a regular basis. Historians claim this lustrum was, or the censuses were done at 5-year periods. They're wrong. And we demonstrated that Censorinus explicitly tells us that it was done at 4-year intervals. We can check both. I've gone ahead and made 2 columns. One assuming that you have a 5-year lustrum, which is wrong, based on what Censorinus tells us. And one based on a 4-year lustrum, which is what Censorinus tells us actually happened. We know from the autobiography of Augustus Caesar there were 3 times in which he was personally involved in closing the lustrum. So these are the times where the lustrum was closed. And from what Censorinus tells us, the lustrum consisted of a revolution of 4 years, and then on the 5th year, the census ended, and they closed the lustrum, and that was the 1st year of the next lustrum. So, what we have here is the first closing of the lustrum after 41 years of not having any censuses. So the closing of the lustrum is the 1st year of the next lustrum. In this case, constitutes of year 1, 2, 3, 4. In year 4, you have the census starts, and by the next year, the census has ended. The numbers have been calculated. The rolls are being Senate rolls are being corrected. New taxes are being imposed, and the lustrum ceremony happens on the 5th year. So the 5th year closes the lustrum. Now, for a 5-year lustrum, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then on the 6th year, you close the lustrum, which no documentation, no documents or texts ever say that. So, but let's check. Let's see if we can verify it. And we can do that by reading the history of Cassius Dio. As I showed you before, Cassius Dio wrote 9 volumes of the history of Rome. The 4th volume ends with the death of Julius Caesar. So we know that after 41 years, Augustus started the taxes, so we need to go into the reign of Augustus, which is the 5th volume. So if we go to the downloaded documents, and we look at the 5th volume of Cassius Dio, and we make a search for census, nothing happens. If we make a search for lustrum, nothing happens. Maybe luster, nothing. Illustrated. So there's nothing, and the volume ends on year BC 33, or actually BC 31, I believe. And we don't expect, and this is unshifted years, BC 31. But we don't expect a lustrum to happen until BC 28. So the fifth volume ends here. So we have a few years to go, and that verifies that. Then we go to the sixth volume of Cassius Dio, and we search for lustrum. Nothing about luster. Gain luster through distinctions. Incidents will illustrate nothing. We can look for census. In there we have several quotes. We can look at the last one. And it says, for what they think is 84, Augustus caused others to carry through his business for him, but he himself took a census, but only of the inhabitants of Italy that had property worth at least 200,000 sesterces, because he didn't want to compel the poor citizens and those living outside of Italy to be listed. Now this quote is very important. This is on page 427, 439 PDF. On volume 6. And there have been many that have commented that you couldn't have had the census in Judea because the Romans didn't do censuses in client countries. Well, that's false. That's completely false. Here we have proof that when the Romans made their census, every Roman citizen in the entire Roman Empire had to go to the places that were registered in registered in the census. And only this year was an exception. Only in this year, which was 4 AD, which is corrected 5 AD. And only this year, they decided to hold a census only for those in Italy. Now, this explains to me why Joseph and his family were able to stay in Egypt for 3.5 years. They didn't have to come back because the census was not held on at that time. They returned to Judea, I think, on 6 AD. So had the census been forced, they would have had to return on 4 AD or 5 AD, and they didn't. They didn't have to. So that's a good explanation. So from this we gather all Roman citizens in the entire Roman Empire had to enroll in the census, except for this year. And he explains why Jesus Christ and his family didn't have to return early. They could stay longer in Egypt because they were not required to. There was no census in the rest of the area. Now, if we go to our list here, and we go to 4 AD, what they think is 4 AD, no, that's 4 BC, 4 AD, we see that took a census. So the census was started on 4 AD. And this is page 427. So I've colored the columns. Green is when the lustrum was closed, and yellow is when the census was started. So census started this year, it finishes before May in this year, and then the lustrum ceremony is done on May 12th on this year. And this is enough proof that it could not have been a 5-year census, a lustrum. It had to have been a 4-year. There's no way, because it doesn't fit. You see, the census in a 5-year lustrum would have been performed in 2 AD, not 4 AD. Started. So, proof right there. We can keep going. Let's look at another one. Next, we can look at the first quote. I think, yeah, the first quote referring to the census. Oops. And he says this is for what they think is BC 28. And these occurrences, let's see. The following year, Caesar held office for the 6th time. He was consul the 6th time. And conformed to all the respects and usages handed down, blah, blah, blah. And then at this particular time, besides attending to his other duties as usual, he completed the taking of the census. So, he's saying that when they think is BC 28, during the 6th consulship, BC 28, they complete the census. So that verifies the autobiography of Augustus. Both Cassius Dio and Augustus say the same thing. We can continue with the next quote, where he talks about census in general and ancient practice in the time of Domitian, which is probably when he was writing after that. Cassius Dio was writing after that time. And then he took another census, but that's when he took over Gaul. And just as they did in Judea when they took it over, they did a census of the population. But this is not a Roman census, so we can ignore it. That was in 27, the year after the other one. And here comes a really interesting one. He's talking about the death of Agrippa. So Agrippa sets out on the campaign, despite the winter had already begun, and this was the year in which Marcus Valerius and Publius Sulpicius were consuls. So we go to our chart, and Marcus Valerius and Sulpicius were BC 12, which corresponds to our 11, BC 11. And then he says that Augustus, when he learned of Agrippa's illness, he set out for Italy, and finding him dead, he conveyed his body to the capital and caused it to lie in state in the Forum. He also delivered the eulogy over the dead after first hanging a curtain in front of the corpse. And Cassius Dio, as a historian, was wondering, well, why? Why? Marcus Agrippa was his one of his best friends. He was an ally. Why would he hang a curtain in front of the corpse, in front of the dead body? And then Cassius Dio tells us, why he did this, I do not know. Some, however, have stated that it was because he was the high priest. Others, that it was because he was performing the duties of the censor. And then Cassius Dio says, but both are mistaken, since neither the high priest is forbidden to look at a corpse, nor the censor, except when he's about to complete the census. So Cassius Dio didn't realize that the completion of the census was that year. If we look at BC 12, what they think is BC 12, that's the year in which the census was being closed. Amazing. So this one would be volume 6. Page 357, 369. So this tells us that he couldn't look at a dead body that year because that was the year in which the census was closed. But Cassius Dio didn't realize that. Did I put the other one in here? Yeah, it took a census. And then it gets more confusing. If you keep reading this, he says, such was the end of Agrippa, who had in every way shown himself to be the noblest of men in his day, and had used the friendship of Augustus with a view to the greatest advantage both for the emperor himself and of the commonwealth. And then he starts talking about what Agrippa did. Blah, 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 blah. He was, And then he's talking about the omens before his death. These were the events connected to Agrippa's death. And then they keep talking about Agrippa. And then how he chose Tiberius as a adopted son. And blah, blah, blah. And then he talks about Drusus. Blah, 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 blah. And then he talks about the next year. In the consulship of Quintus Aelius and Paulus Fabius. And he keeps talking and talking about all the things that happened, about Drusus, all the things that happened to Tiberius after the death of Agrippa. And then finally he says, well, these events were occurring. Augustus took a census. So we don't know while these events were occurring, when the events start. Did they start on the death of Agrippa? The year before Agrippa died? The year after Agrippa died? We don't know. But he's saying that a census was taken in BC 11. Now, BC 11 is here. And you see, it doesn't match either the 4-year or the 5-year censuses. So we have to go with the conclusion that the census was closed when Agrippa died, and that's why Augustus put a curtain in front, so he couldn't perform the closing of the lustrum. Now we can tackle the issue of why the closing of the lustrum was done a year late. I mean, Augustus was pretty sick, maybe that's one of the reasons. But if you look at the posted 5-year and 4-year lustrums, closing of the lustrum should have been done on the consulship of Silius and Munatius Plancus. But nope, it was done here instead. So the fact that it was done means that the census numbers were accepted. So the census was not the problem. The census was accepted, but the ceremony was not held. Now, what happened? What happened after the census was done? You go ahead and assess the wealth of every senator, and then you reassess their taxes. And sometimes you how I call it, you revise the rolls of senators, and you kick some of the senators out because they don't have enough wealth. So we can read what happened on that year, on the year of Silius and Munacius Plancus, which is conventionally stated to be 13 BC, 13 AD, which was actually in 14 AD. So we go to Cassius Dio on volume 6, volume 7 actually. And he says, when Lucius Munacius and Gaius Silius had been installed consuls, Augustus, with seeming reluctance, accepted a fifth 10-year term as the head of the Senate. He again gave Tiberius a tribunician power, and blah blah blah. And then when now nearly all felt burdened by the 5% tax, and an uprising seemed likely. So it seemed that there was going to be an uprising based on the brand new taxes that were going to be enacted on that day because the census was closed. He sent a communication to the Senate bidding his members to seek some other revenue. So he tried to negotiate and saying, well, if you do not like this tax, let's change the tax. He did that. He did this not with the intention of abolishing the tax, but in order that when no other method should seem to them to be better, they should ratify the measure reluctantly, though it might be, without bringing any censure to him. So he says, oh, you don't like the tax? Well, give me alternatives. Kind of knowing that they won't be able to find any. He also ordered both Germanicus and Drusus not to make any statements about it, blah, blah, blah. There was much discussion, and some proposals were submitted to Augustus in writing. When he learned from these that the senators were ready to submit to any form of tax rather than to the one in force, he changed it to a levy upon fields and houses. And immediately, without stating how great it would be or in what way imposed, he sent men out everywhere to make a list of the property of both private individuals and of the cities. So he says, oh yeah, well then I'm gonna put taxes on your houses. I'm gonna praise your houses. How much do you think your house is worth? His object was that they should fear even greater losses and so be content to pay the 5% tax. And this is what actually happened. Thus Augustus handled these matters. And then we go into a horse race at Augustelia, which we're celebrating on his birthday. But his birthday is in August. So all this happened between the beginning of the year and August. So what I propose happened is that the senators were revolting. They were saying, no, we don't want to pay this tax. Augustus says, well, give me ideas on what other tax you might consent to. He didn't get any. So he says, okay, well, tell you what, I'll change the tax from a 5% tax to a taxes on your property, in your houses. So let me go and start assessing the value of the house of every senator. And finally the senator said, no. We agree. We'll pay the tax. And because of this, basically a revolt by the senators, the 12th of May, which was the date in which the lustrum, the ceremonial lustrum, ought to be closed, passed, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't agree before the 12th of May. They agreed, so therefore the agreement came after the 12th of May, but before August 19th, before the horse race at the Augustalia. And I propose that's the reason why they skipped a year and they celebrated the closure of the lustrum the next year on May 12th of AD 15, which would be 14 for their list. So that explains the whole passage. Now that we have mapped all the Roman censuses during the reign of Augustus, we can recap and see how we got here. During my the first class, AMC number 1, we discussed, it's insane that they don't know when Jesus Christ was born or the year that he was born. And they guess and speculate erroneously it was between 6 and 4 BC. We will fix that later regarding the date of the death of King Herod the Great, which he actually died on 2 AD, not in 4 BC. They're clueless. And I show how to use the programs Stellarium, EMAP-Win, and LMAP-Win. It'll be good for you to review these classes that form the foundation for this final result. MC2 shows that Julius Caesar was assassinated on 43 BC and not on 44 BC. That means the list of Roman consuls is off by 1 year. Any number, any year shown in the standard list of Roman consuls should be added by 1. Now in MC3 I find the famous star of Julius Caesar that people wonder what it was. They tried to say that it's a comet. It's not a comet. It was a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter. And that proves that Julius Caesar died in 43 BC instead of 44 BC. Same result as before. So the list of Roman consuls is off by 1 year. In class AMC4, we discussed the first day of the Julian calendar. Why was the Julian calendar's first day selected such that the vernal equinox was not March 25th, it was March 23 instead, and the winter solstice was not the traditional date of December 25th, it was December 23rd. It was off by 2 days. Why did he do that? He did that because there was a conjunction between Venus and Saturn that could be seen on January 1st of 43 BC instead of 44 BC. So that means that, 44 BC instead of 45 BC. That means that his fourth consulate of Julius Caesar was from 44 BC instead of 45 BC. Again, the list of Roman consuls is off by 1 year. And the whole list is shifted up because, as I'll show in some later episode, there's inserted pair of names that should be suffix consuls, and they were taken as regular consuls by mistake. And then the last class, AMC 5, I discussed the leap day error that the Romans did and how the Romans enumerate sets. What they call a 5-year set is actually 4 years because it repeats in the 5th year. And if you told them do something every 4 years, they think it's a 4-year set, which means it repeats every 3 years because it repeats in the 4th year. It's insane. But once you realize how the Romans thought, it explains the whole sequence of the censuses. Now, this is the same way that the Jewish thought about sets as well. They have the Jubilee is done every 49 years, but it's celebrated on the 50th year. And that has confused many scholars, thinking that it repeated every 50 years. It's not. It repeats every 49 years because it's celebrated on the 50th year, which is the first year of the next 49 years, just like the Romans. So there's an equivalency there. I'm not sure if they still measure sets that way during the time of Christ, but this is like 1,000 years before when the whole celebration of the Jubilees started. And now we come to the results on this class, this episode. We had determined that there were Roman censuses that started on 28 BC and completed on 27 BC when the lustrum was held. The closure of the lustrum ceremony was held. There was a census from 24 BC to 23 BC, from 20 BC to 19 BC, from 16 BC to 15 BC, from 12 BC to 11 BC, from 8 to 7 BC, from 4 to 3 BC, and from 1 to 2 AD. And that proves that Jesus Christ was born during that Roman census. We have gone completely outside any Jewish measurements or any Jewish avenue for calculating the census or when Jesus Christ was born. And this is purely using the documentation from Roman records. I did it a different way on my book on the birthday of Jesus Christ, as told by the New Testament. Now, the 5 to 6 AD census is an exception and was taken only in Italy. And that means with all these other censuses involved every citizen of the Roman Empire, regardless of where they were. This was the only census that was done only in Italy. And that's the reason why the family of Jesus Christ was able to stay several years in Egypt and came back after the census would have been taken, because there was no census in Judea, a Roman census. Then there was a census on 9 to 10 AD and a census from 13 to 4 AD, and the census was completed, so the data was correct, except that that year, sensing that Augustus was very sick, he was ill, they thought they could push him around. The senators decided they were not going to pay the tax. They had just been reassessed through the censors, and they refused to pay the tax. And there were some discussions, and finally they relented. But by then, the date of May 12 had passed, and they had to push the ceremony of the closing of the lustrum to the year after. Now we can talk a little bit about the birthday of Jesus Christ. If we make a column for the year in which the reign of Tiberius starts, and another column for Jesus' age, we see that Augustus died on August 19th during the consulship of Sextus Pompeius and Sextus Apuleius. So that would be, he starts in this year. Let's call that year 1. But that runs from August until the next August. So if something happened around March or spring, it would be actually the next year. So let's count the years. Count 15 years here. And like I said, March would be the next year and still be within the reign of Tiberius, the 15th year of Tiberius. Now, Jesus Christ was beginning to be about 30. So if we put on that year 30, and we subtract back to around this time. We see that Jesus Christ was 1 year old, or in his first year, on the census that started on 180. So there is no guesswork, no confusion. We know, because we know when the census has happened, then we can figure out on what year Jesus Christ was born. And that year was 180. Red sounds bad. Yeah, good color like that. That's when he was 1 year old. Now we need to, as I discussed before, the ancients didn't have a year zero. So what would you call a 9-month-old baby? To us, it's 0 years in 9 months. But to the ancients, that was his first year of his life. So he would be in the 9th month of his first year. That's why it starts at 1 instead of 0. If somebody was, for us, was 3 years and 3 months old, that means that the person was in his 4th year and 3 months old. So our years old are always 1 year less than the ancient year old. Anyway, we have proven the sequence of Roman censuses. From that, we have proven that Jesus Christ was born in AD, which is kind of fortunate. I mean, he was a priest. I don't recall the name. Let's see. Anno Domini. In the year of our Lord, and he was set by Dionysius. He was devised in 525 by Dionysius Exiguus. And we're so fortunate that he didn't make a mistake. He got it right. Otherwise, we'll have to have a Anno Dominis that's real versus the Anno Dominus that's traditional. It would be a mess. But it turns out that he calculated correctly in the year 525. And we're very fortunate. And that's what it is. And one more thing. We calculated that the 15th of Tiberius started in the 19th of August of 29 AD. And then it ran to the 29th of August of 30 AD. That means the spring of the 15th of Tiberius was during the consulship of Fufius Geminus and Rubilius Geminus on 30 AD. And these are very famous consuls. As we shall see later, Tertullian says that these were the consuls when Jesus Christ was 30 years old. So this verifies that fact as well. As far as I know, I am the only person that has been able to determine when the Roman censuses happened. Everybody else is lost. Everybody else accuses Luke of being wrong. Everybody else confuses the first census of Quirinus with the second census of Quirinus. Even though in the first census Quirinus wasn't even the governor of Syria, he was a legate working for Saturninus, as Tertullian tells us. I'll talk about it in the next episode. And this solves such a huge problem. It took a while and a lot of effort to do it. We had to go through 5 previous videos in order to get to this point. And it took some work. So I tried to explain it step by step so there is no confusion, to make sure that it is certain, it's precise, there are no guesstimates, no assumptions, no best guesses. This is what our astronomical tools and the historical record tells us. And I've proven that Jesus Christ, on his birthday, was the year that the Roman Census was started. If you want to continue to support my work, please like and subscribe, or you may also buy one of my books. I'll put them on the link below. But what really matters is please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you.